Hey guys, when you search for Bible-related stuff, virtually all the results are from Christian pastors and apologists.
Yeah, to find real biblical criticism, you need to dig down. Most people never even learn about all the scholarship out there, which debunks a lot of the evangelical claims.
Yeah, there's an entire well-funded industry of biased Christian content out there.
Our show tries to offer a counter-argument to them, but we rely on our listeners to keep the show going week after week. If you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project.
Thank you to all those supporting us. We hope you enjoy the show. I'm John.
And I'm Ben.
And this is the Skeptics Bible Project. We read the Bible
so you don't have to.
I don't care too much for preachers. I don't like to go to church. But I'd hate to meet St. Peter when my body leaves this earth.
Hello and welcome to the show. This is the Skeptics Bible Project. Happy to be here with you again. How are you, Ben?
I'm doing well, John. How are you?
I'm doing great. So, Ben, the last few weeks have been pretty interesting in the New Testament studies universe. There's been a new manuscript revealed, and they've come out with the findings. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So this is the Egyptian Exploration Society, and this is the publish of the Oxyrhynchus papyri.
I always said Oxyrhynchus, but I don't know.
Oxyrhynchus, that's probably right. So this was actually discovered in the 1880s in Egypt, but there were so many of these texts that they discovered that they're still slowly going through them. It was like a giant ancient trash dump.
So they're from roughly the 1st century.
So they range, I think, all the way back from the 3rd century BCE.
Oh, wow.
Up till maybe the 3rd or 4th century CE. There's like a really wide range of ages. So I think it's taking a very long time to go through and catalog these. And this particular papyri was involved in a theft and then was sold to the Green family, who are affiliated with Hobby Lobby and the Museum of the Bible. Another long tangential part of the story. But they found this papyri. This is number 5573. The first papyri was actually appeared in 1898. So this has been like a multi-generational project to get these papyri pieces translated. And initially this was reported to be part of the Gospel of Matthew. But now, as scholars, like just last week, the scholars that are doing the translating came out with the, started showing other scholars their work and came out with their initial dating and some more information about the papyri. So it's dated from the 2nd century, probably 2nd century, maybe early 3rd century. And the way that they did that was by examining the style of the lettering, which is not the most precise way to date a document, but that's the first step. And so if it's a 2nd century document, it's one of the oldest Christian texts that we have. And the thing that makes this really interesting from my perspective, and I think, John, you would agree, is that it contains sayings that are sort of topical and have to do with like worry and anxiety, but they're sayings that exist in forms that are found in Matthew, in Luke, and also the Gospel of Thomas. So you have a combination of sayings from different Gospels, including a non-canonical Gospel, the Gospel of Thomas.
So I think it's worth saying that we have almost nothing from this era of Christianity. There's just fragments. So if this truly is a mid-2nd century document, as it seems like most scholars are saying it is, it really is one of the biggest finds in New Testament studies in centuries. And so it's quite amazing. And yeah, the fact that it seems to be a group of sayings, it goes along with this idea that's maybe some of the first gospels that were being spread around were just sayings of Jesus with no narratives at all. This is exactly what the Gospel of Thomas is, and it's what the hypothesized Gospel of Q is. I think there's a little bit of a controversy in that some of the people, and I don't know all the details of this, but some of the people involved with the study are evangelicals and were kind of promoting this as, this will bolster the conservative view of the manuscript tradition, because it's basically a segment of Matthew which shows that there was a consistency from the earliest followers of Jesus to what we have now with keeping an organized account of the words of Jesus. And the Gospel of Matthew has been established like a stone from the beginning and unchanging. But as it's been revealed and published, we find that's not the case at all. This is a group of different sayings that are not consistent with any one gospel, and in fact has sections from the Gospel of Thomas in it, which, most modern Christians want to basically throw out or ignore. So anyway, that's what's interesting to me. I mean, what I want to hear more from scholars about is the implications of especially the Gospel of Thomas. It's likely that these sayings that we find in Thomas existed extremely early, which may bolster this idea that Thomas itself was a very early text.
Yeah, it's funny because there's sort of like a dual movement. Because on the one hand, it would be good for Christianity to date this text early for some reasons. But they also have reasons to want to date it later, and that's because of the inclusion of the Gospel of Thomas. So the scholars that think the Gospel of Thomas is early still usually only date it to maybe like the mid-2nd century. And a lot of scholars would probably put it into the 3rd century. Now, this really, if this is from the 2nd century, obviously the Gospel of Thomas, those sayings were around before the 3rd century. So it really puts to rest this notion that the Gospel of Thomas is late. The earliest fragment we have right now is from the Gospel of John, I believe, and it's from 140 CE. Which would be the 2nd century. So this could be contemporaneous with that, which would make it, if this is before 140, then this is the oldest fragment that we have. And it's one of the oldest fragments that we have if it's from the 1st century. So,
yeah, I want to jump in and say there are scholars that date Thomas as early as 50.
I know like John Crossan, I think, believes that Thomas is earlier than the Gospels, the Synoptics. So there definitely is that.
And there's good reason to think he's not the only one. There are, I think you're right. The majority view is that Thomas comes from 2nd century, possibly 3rd century, but there is a significant number of scholars that put it very early, and there's some good reason for that. Some of the sayings of Jesus that first of all, it's a sayings gospel, which were kind of out of style by the 2nd and 3rd century, it seems like, and it seems like the sayings gospels likely preceded the canonical gospels, the narrative style gospels. So that's a reason to think it could be early. But also some of the sayings that they put on Jesus' lips in the Gospel of Thomas seem to be a more archaic, like a simpler, earlier version of the saying, which has led many to believe that the version of Thomas that we have now may be like a later version of the text where there was an earlier version and then it changed over time, which is certainly possible. So it's, like everything with New Testament studies, it's complicated. But for those of you interested in it, it's endlessly fascinating. And you can spend just hours going down every rabbit hole in the world. But yeah, I'm really anxious to hear scholars talk about the implications of this. So far, it's mostly been kind of reporting what the findings are, what the text says, and the possible dating. But I'm interested to kind of hear their takes on the implications of it. What does it mean in the long run?
Yeah, I was on a TikTok with Candida Moss, and she was talking a little bit about. She actually was one of the first people from outside the initial group to have access to seeing a copy of the text. And she basically said the same thing. I mean, it makes the conventional accepted dating of the Gospel of Thomas as like it creates a problem for dating the Gospel of Thomas in the 3rd century as a Gnostic text. So it pushes it forward in some people's mind. It also shows that the Gospel of Thomas was considered canonical in some sense, or, was included along with other quotes from the Gospels. And then the other thing that's interesting is a lot of the phrasing of the sayings is very inconsistent, like not consistently Matthew, not consistently Luke, which she said indicates that the scribe was not as concerned with like carefully copying the text. So again, I mean, that's something we hear from evangelicals all the time, that these scribes were fanatically careful to make sure that they copied the text perfectly and preserved the word. It doesn't seem from this fragment that that's the case. And I also just think that it's interesting because it creates sort of another type of literature that must have been going around in the early church at that time, where there were sayings collected into some sort of thematic. So you have these like texts that deal with anxiety. So I wonder about the larger text that it was part of, or if this was something that was like, what was this used for? Was this just another form of literature? Yeah, so I think it's got a lot of interesting layers, and scholars are super excited about it. And again, it's just one of the, if the dating is correct so far, then this could be one of the oldest pieces of Christian literature that we actually have a copy of.
So on this show, we'll keep you guys updated with anything we find out, and it's something that we're definitely going to continue to talk about as we go forward. But today we wanted to talk about pseudepigrapha, or as it's also known, forgeries. So in the ancient world, in order to get your writing more attention and have more authority, oftentimes an author might lie and claim that they were a prominent figure in order to gain traction, in order to gain attention. So we have this, that both Christians and non-Christian scholars will agree with, that you have letters in the name of Paul that Paul didn't actually write, letters in the name of Peter that Peter didn't actually write. And we can go through some of those. There's the Epistle of Barnabas. We all know about 1st and 2nd Corinthians in the Bible, but there's a 3rd Corinthians that we have, and you can go and read it. But scholars have long known that these are forgeries or pseudepigrapha. They are not written by the person who claims to be writing it. But the question for us is there any books in our canonical Bibles, the Bibles that you can pick up and read in church? Are there any books in there that are forgeries, that are written by someone other than who they claim to be? Now, we have to make a distinction because there's also false attribution. So let's take the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, these aren't forgeries. We have no idea who wrote Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the title, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were added centuries later. So the original Gospels likely circulated totally anonymously. So we have no idea who the author is. So those aren't forgeries. They're people made this attribution to them much later. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. But then you have books like 1st and 2nd Peter, where the author says, hey, I'm Peter, and you should listen to me. And you have the epistles of Paul, which makes up the majority of the New Testament, that says, I, Paul, am writing this to you, so you should listen to me. And are any of those books forgeries? Well, as it turns out, scholars for a long time now have said, yes, as a matter of fact, some of them are forgeries. Some of them are pseudepigrapha. So we thought it would be an important series to do, because we've talked about this a lot on previous episodes, but we thought taking a deep dive into this and go through the books individually and talk about why scholars think this is a forgery, or maybe why scholars think this is not a forgery. Some of them are debated, and some of them are really not very debated. So if it's okay with you, Ben, I thought maybe we would start with Ephesians, Colossians, which are epistles from the Apostle Paul, allegedly, and they've circulated in the church for centuries, for millennia, as authoritative words from the Apostle Paul. But many scholars believe that Paul didn't actually write these letters. And I know Ephesians, Colossians are much more debated than some of the other books, which we'll talk about in the future. But why, Ben, is Ephesians and Colossians kind of always grouped together when people discuss them?
That's a very good question. So the letters of Ephesians and Colossians seem to have a relationship with each other. They have a lot of words and phrases that are in common. And most scholars, or a lot of scholars, think that the author of Ephesians probably used Colossians as one of the sources. There are different theological ideas that are in agreement in Ephesians and Colossians that are stand in contrast to some of the undisputed Pauline letters, and we can talk about that in a minute. There's also household codes in both of the books that seem very similar and follow each other pretty closely. So there's some good reasons based on this to sort of lump these two letters together.
Yeah, my understanding is that a lot of it has to do with specificity. Paul talks about, in his letters to other churches, he seems intimately knowledgeable about what's going on in those churches, and he's writing about very specific problems. And when you read through Ephesians, for instance, it's very general, where it's more broad, not talking to specific issues going on. And as we go through these, we'll be learning a little bit about like what criteria scholars use to make these determinations. So one is stylistic differences. In Ephesians, the terminology that and phrases that Paul uses seems different from his authentic letters. His sentences are much more complex in Ephesians, and also really long, intricate sentences with like deep theological content. And I know F.F. Bruce points that out, and another prominent biblical scholar. And so that's a very common technique that scholars will use. Another is the theological development. Is Paul's theological philosophy, or are the concepts that he's using the same that he's used elsewhere, or are they novel? And it seems in Ephesians they seem to be novel. They seem to be, like Paul is emphasizing something that he hasn't emphasized before, or maybe even talking about, things that seem to contradict what he said in other letters. The church structure, this is important. So this is like a historical criteria that scholars will use. Are there any anachronisms in it? And an anachronism is when a writer is pretending to be writing from an earlier point in time than he is actually living in. So an anachronism would be like if the Apostle Paul was talking about using ChatGPT, that would be an anachronism because ChatGPT didn't exist in the days of Paul. But what we find in Ephesians, and I think in Colossians, is what seems to be like a more organized hierarchical church structure than existed in the actual time of Paul. Like when you read in 1 Corinthians, for instance, a genuine letter of Paul, or in Romans, it really seems like groups of people meeting in houses, and there wasn't a high church structure. But in Ephesians, it seems to hint at a much more organized hierarchical church structure, and we can go through some of those examples. When you get to the pastoral epistles, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, you have a much higher version of the church with elders and deacons, and that's one of the primary reasons that scholars have said no. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are written much later, not by Paul. Ephesians, though, and Colossians are a little bit more debatable for some of these reasons that I'm talking about. Ben talked a little bit about ethical and household codes. Again, they seem more general as opposed to specific guidance that Paul provides in his other letters. Unclear historical context. So again, with historical context, Ephesians lacks specific references to historical events. And so it's really challenging to pinpoint its historical context. and the ambiguity of the audience. It's hard to determine the precise audience and the purpose of Ephesians. So where that's not hard to figure out at all when you read something like Romans. And then I think most damning for authentic authorship of Paul is the manuscript evidence. There's just very little early manuscript evidence of Ephesians. We only have a small number of early manuscripts. In other words, it wasn't widespread in the early church. And why is that when the other letters clearly were? And it was not included on many early lists of Paul's letters. So early church fathers would make a list of like, these are Paul's letters. And Ephesians is notably absent from many of those lists.
I think that Ephesians and Colossians, I know that Bart Ehrman emphasizes in his book that reading both Ephesians and Colossians in the Greek, you really get a sense of how long the sentences are. And a lot of times those sentences are even shortened in English. And that's just not the way that Paul wrote. So it's another example of why these two books are similar and why they're sort of dissimilar to the authentic letters of Paul. Now, of course, like someone could write in a different style. People do that. But there are like linguistic techniques that people use and people that are professional. And I know that Ehrman likes to use the example of, if you put a Hemingway quote in the middle of a book by James Joyce, you're going to realize that it's some different author has all of a sudden been inserted. There's just a different style to your writing, even if you change up some of your content. One of the things that I find most interesting where Colossians and Ephesians agree is about the timing of when believers are risen with Christ. So for Paul, one of the big distinctions he makes in Corinth is about how believers have died in Christ or died along with Christ, and they will be risen with Christ in the future. They will be saved in the future when Christ returns. That is completely shifted in Ephesians and Colossians, like we're already raised with Christ. And so I think it reflects a different understanding. We're already seeing, John and I always like to emphasize this sort of early expectation of Christ's return in the church, that they thought it was going to happen in their lifetime. They thought it was going to happen any time now. Paul, the authentic Paul, is writing in sort of that wrinkle in time before the end, where he's sort of at an impasse in history. And Paul is not, the real Paul is not concerned. He's much less concerned with like the present age that's fading away, and everything is always happening in the future. So for the real Paul to say that we're going to be risen in the future, well, he's looking at a future that is coming soon. It's an expectant hope that he sees like right on the horizon. In Ephesians and Colossians, it's been pushed forward so that we're already saved, we're already risen, and it's sort of like a hunkering down for the time being. So it has like a longer view of Earth and less of a expectant view of the return of Christ.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark difference between the genuine letters of Paul and what you find in Ephesians and Colossians, because you're right. Like we emphasize all the time, this imminent return of Christ just permeates the genuine letters of Paul. This is what the people he's writing to were expecting, because this is in the lifetime of some of the original followers. This is what they believed was the promise coming from Jesus. This was their big hope. And you start seeing a shift away from the imminent return of Jesus, and more toward the kind of long-term holding fast, what's our Christian lifestyle going out into the future going to look like. And I think that's a pretty big shift and a pretty big reason to think that, hey, this is probably written at a later date here.
Yeah, and like in a practicality. So I think that like the best thing to do is to try to kind of read Galatians and First Corinthians against Colossians and Ephesians, because the whole tirade against the Corinthian church was that they were saying they were already risen with Christ. Like, we're already living in spiritual resurrection with Christ. We can do whatever we want. And Paul is like, no, you're wrong. You're not risen with Christ yet. And now Paul is saying, yeah, we're all risen with Christ. We're already saved. So it's like giving it like exactly the opposite message that Paul is telling the Corinthian church. And so you say, okay, maybe Paul changed his mind. Maybe Paul came to a different view. Okay, that's possible. And then the other thing is like the even more practical level of the household codes. We have, and this like gets exasperated further in the pastoral epistles, which we'll talk about another time probably. But you have this setting down of this is how families should be regulated. So slaves obey your masters, and husbands obey, wives obey. You submit to your husbands, and husbands love your wives, and children obey your parents. And this is like not, Paul is basically talking about living in the time, like living as if none of these roles matter anymore. Like in Galatians, that's his whole thing. So now all of a sudden he's setting up these like sort of social hierarchies and social structures. It just really goes and runs against the message of the authentic Paul. And I think a lot of the other reasons are convincing, but for me, like these theological problems are a lot harder to resolve because you're talking about like a pretty essential parts of the genuine Paul's message. And this is what I think like becomes a real problem is reading Ephesians. Like I know we've talked about, I don't know if you mentioned F.F. Bruce this time, but I think F.F. Bruce reads Ephesians as like the central Pauline epistle. So he uses that to interpret all the genuine, undisputed Pauline epistles. And once you do that, you're shifted away from what Paul is saying, and you're allowing this sort of reinterpretation to cloud the way that you read the initial Paul. So I see this happen a lot. I mean, I saw this is a little bit of a tangent, but like the Gospel Coalition, which was Tim Keller's organization, this guy had written a book about the church as the bride of Christ, and it had all this like sort of like misogynistic language, and it ended up creating all this controversy. And like he almost exclusively drew from Ephesians and Colossians. And he used Ephesians and Colossians to reinterpret Paul's teachings about singleness in Corinthians. So it's like, at a certain point, you're just missing the message of like the real Paul by trying to interpret him through these later interpolations.
Yeah, and I think Ephesians and Colossians is a little bit difficult because it's kind of hard to figure out the purpose of the author, like why the author would be writing in the name of Paul. What is he changing that Paul hasn't already said? This is very clear when you read the pastoral epistles, like I mentioned before, about what this author is trying to do. This author is clearly shifting. He wants authority in the church away from women. And we'll get into that as we go through the pastoral epistles in a future episode. But with Ephesians, it's not quite as clear. So that's what scholars look at. Now, I have a few quotes here from some scholars. I want to go through some of them. I don't know who all of these scholars are. Ben, you might know some of them more than me. Raymond Brown is on here, and I certainly know him. But C.K. Barrett says, the language of Ephesians is the most classical Greek in the New Testament. Its vocabulary is vast, and many of its phrases are unique in the Pauline corpus. So that goes to what we're saying. Like, why is this author using words and phrases that Paul doesn't use anywhere else? I know when we get to 2 Peter, we're going to talk about some of the words were not even in circulation at the time the Apostle Peter was living. So that's a very big clue that it was written long after the real Peter was dead. But in Ephesians, we see a little bit of that also. Raymond Brown, who is one of my favorites, says, Catholic theologian and scholar, he says, Ephesians, therefore, could not have been written by Paul. Even though it uses words that were in Paul's vocabulary, the concepts expressed in this letter are more developed than those found in his undoubtedly authentic writings. So that's interesting. He's talking about his kind of theological concepts and how it seems to be like a more developed version of it, which makes sense if it was written after the life of Paul. Harold Honer says, the absence of personal references and local situations make it difficult to harmonize with Paul's other letters. The theological and ecclesiastical differences between Ephesians and the undisputed Pauline letters are striking. So that's interesting. We talked a little bit about that before. Marcus Barth says, Ephesians stands apart from the rest of Paul's letters in that it lacks a clear historical context. This ambiguity raises questions about its authorship. Just a couple more. Andrew Lincoln, the audience and purpose of Ephesians remains uncertain, making it challenging to establish its authenticity as a Pauline letter. And then it wouldn't be an episode of our show if we didn't quote Bart Ehrman, who says, it's possible that Ephesians was written by a later Christian leader who admired Paul's theology, but was not the apostle himself.
Yeah, so I think that I agree with almost all of that, or most of it. I think Raymond Brown talks about Ephesians. There's a theory that the letter was passed along to churches without any specific geographical address, and it could be, it could be given to this church. I think that he even says that Marcion may have had it as the letter to the Laodiceans. Not sure. So I may be wrong about that, but you can email us if I am. But I think he said there's not really a lot of historical evidence in the ancient world of letters going around like that, where they don't have an addressee and they're just kind of like shared by communities, but that's a possibility. I think the interesting thing is Colossae was actually, I think that's how you pronounce the name of the city. Again, send all complaints to emails if I'm getting it wrong, was actually destroyed in an earthquake in 61 CE, they think. So, for it to be a genuine letter to a Christian community there, it has to date before 61, because the city was destroyed. And so that gives it that's like a tight timeline. I guess it's fine because you don't have Paul living that long into the 60s anyway, probably. But it makes it very close to the other letters of Paul that we can compare it to, as far as language and theologically developed ideas. And it does seem to not be in step with those other letters that we would put as contemporaneous.
So let me jump in let me ask you a question, Ben. Paul, according to Christians, was writing under the direct inspiration of God, correct?
That is the evangelical position.
And you're telling me that Colossae, the city, was destroyed in something like 61 AD?
Yes.
And Paul's writing them a letter basically coming from God. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a little bit of a warning, like, hey, guys, get out of the city?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I think that so what a lot of people think is that the author of Colossians had Ephesians, and maybe also had Philemon, and were using those letters to try to construct a letter that seemed like Paul, but because he was using a forged letter, it ends up sounding a lot like Ephesians. And that Colossae may have been a place that was, at this point, I think the theory is not that the letter is going to be sent to the Colossian church in order to fool them, but that it's supposed to fool other people that it was a letter to that community. And maybe the fact that it was destroyed in 61 makes it easier to there's not necessarily people in that community to say this is a fake letter.
I mean, the letter talks a lot about, watching out for false teachers and false philosophies. But I think if it said, like, watch out for your whole city being destroyed, it may have been more beneficial to them in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally a fair point, especially when you think that this letter would have to be arriving pretty close to that time. So, if it comes to you in 55, if it says in 6 years there's going to be a gigantic earthquake that destroys your city.
I'm just saying that would have been helpful information.
You would think that would be helpful.
But I'm being cynical, but I think there is a point there. Let me quote some scholars that think it is genuine, or at least arguing more for the genuineness. So we mentioned F.F. Bruce before. He says, this is talking about Ephesians, "The letter's credentials indeed are impressive, and its right to a place in the New Testament canon has never been seriously challenged, although doubts have been raised from time to time." So for me, this is saying, like, well, the church has traditionally kept it in the canon, so that alone is reason that we can accept it as genuine. And you kind of hear variations of that argument a lot, even to this day. And to me, that's not very convincing, because I think the whole point is to kind of look at church tradition and see where maybe they've gotten it wrong.
Yeah, I think this is like a really problematic position. Once you start examining canonization as a concept, it gets extremely dicey to nail down when there was actually an established canon. There's never a church council that decides until I think the 1300s. So there are different people saying this is the canon, or don't use these books anymore, or church fathers that emphasize this. But we have a variety of canons. And in the 1500s, when Martin Luther was questioning having the Reformation, one of the fundamental things that he questioned was the canon. He wanted to put James as an appendix. He was not sure about the book of Revelation. So things were an open question for Martin Luther. I think we shouldn't be closed off to examining these books from a really critical perspective, to say that if it's a book that Paul didn't write, we shouldn't just say, well, at this point, it confirms Christian theology, and so therefore it doesn't really matter if Paul wrote it or Paul didn't write it. We've accepted it as being Pauline, so it must be Pauline. I mean, that's like a very circular logic that doesn't actually tell you who wrote the letter. It just tells you that you want to keep it in the book, and you don't really want to take a critical look at it.
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, I have a little bit of sympathy for that, because if you're saying, look, what we think of as Pauline canon, we're not even claiming it goes back to the actual Paul as much as the tradition of the Pauline canon. If Christians held that view, I think that's a little bit more of a liberal view, to be like, well, we're just talking about what the church has traditionally said, and we're not even really addressing the authorship. But that's not what the evangelical church in America does. Conservative Christians, they say no. If it's in the canon, it means Paul actually wrote it, and I think the genuine Apostle Paul, the historical Apostle Paul, would be not happy that there were books circulated in his name, for thousands of years after he's been gone, that he didn't write, and he likely disagrees with some of. But that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. I think that, and I just want to problematize tradition. Because what tradition are you holding to? Again, I just think that's evangelicals would say it's sola scriptura, or Reformed people would say it's sola scriptura, but evangelicals basically would say, we get our ideas from the Bible. And so you're having some confidence at some point in time that the Bible is the inspired word of God. But what I'm saying is I don't understand when that starts, because when do you finally decide these are the books of the Bible that are the inspired word of God? That's a historical claim that's made in a historical time. And I think when they trace back the history, it gets really dicey too. Like that's almost like a Catholic position where church history plays a role in how the Bible is interpreted, as well as like ecclesiastical authority and how the Bible is interpreted. And based on those three levels, you kind of get what you have. I mean, that's not something that the evangelical church would affirm, but that does seem to be like something that they kind of hold to in a way.
Yeah.
Because and my point is just that, like, I think there should be really another Reformation in the evangelical church. And I think part of it comes from critically looking at these texts again and realizing things like Paul didn't write Ephesians and Colossians. And here's the reasons why we say that. We list these examples. And if we think that's true, then we have to adjust our theology somehow, whether we differentiate between those two. I mean, I guess it doesn't matter that much for evangelicals because they think all of the Bible is telling the same message, so they wouldn't differentiate between the message between Paul and Peter and James anyway. But I think that, like, it's important who wrote the book. It's important to say, when you're talking about Colossians and Ephesians, to say, Paul said this, or the author of Ephesians or Colossians said this. And there's a difference to that. One is saying it's a figure that we know that the church affirms, and the other is recognizing that we don't really know who wrote this. And I just think that is an important distinction.
Yeah, I picked up a Catholic Bible and I read they have an introduction to the authors of each book, and it heavily cast doubt on the authorship of Ephesians. You can probably tell that I've studied more about Ephesians than Colossians. But it heavily cast doubt on the authorship of Ephesians, something I would not find in any Bible in the church I grew up in, and the evangelical in the Protestant world. But Ben, I thought that was a great point you made, and about how evangelicals really want their cake and eat it too. They want to say, no, we don't go by church tradition. We go by the words of the Bible. And then, but when it comes down to, well, how do you determine if it's a genuine letter of Paul? It's like, well, the tradition of the church has held this forever. It's like, well, wait a second. I thought that's what you were throwing out. And when you go back to Martin Luther, I've mentioned this in previous episodes, he was kind of doing what you were talking about. I mean, that was the Reformation. He was the start of the first Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. And he's saying he was doing that to a degree. He was going in and saying, well, I don't think this is genuine. I don't think this should be in the Bible. And this is genuine. This should be in the Bible. And you're right. I think that actually would be a very helpful exercise for the modern church to go through now, and it would really help get them away from this stark fundamentalism that has really caused a lot of suffering in the church. I mean, the role of women comes to mind. We've done 2 episodes on that, and how the some of the fake letters of Paul are some of the harshest words of against women in the entire Bible, and we'll get into that later in Bible versus Bible. But I thought that was a really good point you made. It's like, okay, is it church tradition or not? And if it's not, then all of this should be up for discussion.
And I think it's like sort of a myth that there's this single tradition that's running through. I mean, we talk about early Christianity because I think it's even more mythologized, that there's this idea that, like, there was this proto-orthodoxy that comes right from the Galilean Jesus movement right into the first Greek Christians, and then it's preserved all through time, right? Like the same message always from Jesus to us. There was like a line, and there may be like divergent streams around it, but there is like some invisible church that's always been present. But the reality is there was a bunch of conflict always over who was right and who was wrong, and different ideas about interpretations, even in the earliest church. So once they start tracing, I mean, like I saw James White talking about Augustine and having to draw a distinction between the 2 Augustines. One is like the ecclesiastical Augustine that is like concerned with church authority, and the other one is the Augustine of saved by faith through grace. And it's like, okay, so, but you're like, at that point, you're not claiming Augustine. You're claiming one thing that Augustine said. And like, I just don't understand how this mechanism works, tracing back this like invisible line of tradition. And I think like the reality is it's just like much sloppier when you look at the actual history. And there's a lot of other factors besides just like this whole question of authorship really complicates the canon. It was a big emphasis in deciding what books should be affirmed. This like idea of apostolic succession was a big deal to the early church in establishing what books should be read as canon. Again, not like that it was all agreed upon by everyone at one given time. Now the idea of apostolic succession in the evangelical church is not accepted. I mean, but sometimes it is when it comes to affirming the disciples were martyred, or that Polycarp knew the disciples of Jesus. Like, it's just weird the things that are accepted and not accepted, and the kind of like unconscious appeal to tradition that happens in evangelicalism. Like, systematic theology is just like part appeal to tradition and tradition's understanding of the text. Like, it's just what it is.
Yeah, and there's so much historical information out there that it's kind of easy to create your own roadmap to whatever endpoint you want, to whatever theology you want, and that's what, Christians do in every denomination in the world. And I think that's what they do here. So you can use Catholic talking points if it backs up your ultimate point, and when it doesn't, you don't. I did want to get to some other quotes from some scholars that think that it likely was authored by Paul, talking about Ephesians here. This is John Stott. He says, "The evidence against Paul's authorship of Ephesians is not decisive. After all, there is no dispute about the authenticity of Ephesians within the early church. It was known and cited by the apostolic fathers." So like we mentioned earlier, that's true, but there's a lot of apostolic fathers that notably left it out, as if they didn't have any awareness of it at all. So I think the point is, yes, once it was in circulation, it seems pretty quickly to have been accepted as a genuine letter of Paul. But the point is, like, when was it found? How come it didn't even exist earlier? And that's, I think, what the real question is.
Yeah, Raymond Brown brings up an interesting point when it comes to like the ecclesiology of Ephesians and Colossians, that they seem to have like a higher church ecclesiology. Again, like they're starting that beginning of an emphasis on church leadership and submitting to authority. And so I can see political, social reasons why the church fathers would affirm those books and like them as they're starting to build the authority of the Catholic Church in its like proto stages.
Let me get to a couple others. Gordon Fee says, "While Ephesians does differ in style from some of Paul's other letters, it still displays characteristic Pauline themes and theological emphasis. The differences can be explained by the unique occasion and purpose of this letter." And that's interesting because we really don't know the occasion and purpose of the letter. So he's saying that, I assume he's saying that if we knew that, it would shed light on why we do see these differences. I've heard it said that Ephesians was a kind of a collection of Pauline sayings, maybe some short letters that had been collected and grouped together into what we now have as Ephesians. Again, this is all total speculation, but I also think a lot of it is doing anything you can to make it genuine Pauline, and coming up with any excuse that gets you to that endpoint.
Yeah, it's just like, I mean, I don't want to push back on every point. I actually like Gordon Fee. He's passed away at this point, but I just think that like the genuine Pauline letters that we have do address really specific things that are going on in the churches that he's talking to, and the fact that these letters don't do that, I mean, it's not decisive by any means, but I think it is like a clue that it's not Pauline. And I think we've talked about that it uses Paul's language. I think, again, it references people and things that are in Paul's genuine letter of Philemon, I believe in Colossians. So
I always said Philemon.
Philemon, yeah, I'm sorry. And so I think that it's it's definitely possible that this person was imitating Paul's style because he had access to some of Paul's letters, but there's a difference in the way that he uses Paul's language too. The difference that we've demonstrated. When are we saved? When are we risen with Christ? So I think that those differences are important to highlight. And just using the same word, but using it in a completely different way, doesn't mean that it's the same author.
So I just have one more from D.A. Carson, who says, the argument for later authorship based on stylistic differences is not conclusive. Paul was capable of adapting his writing style to different occasions and audiences. So to me, this comes down to probabilities. It's like, yes, that's true. Any author can, if you're writing to a different audience, you might say things in a different way or write in a different style. That's totally true. But just speaking about probabilities, when a historian or a critical scholar is reviewing the text, what's more likely that Paul drastically changed his entire writing style for this letter, or that, like many other forged letters we find, this is just belongs in that group as well?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. I mean, the problem is you could make that same argument again for 3 Corinthians. Maybe Paul's just changing his style, and it is a genuine letter. Like it just because it has later uses of languages. I mean, Paul's adaptable. Maybe he was ahead of his time. Like, you have to have some standard that you're using. And I think evangelicals tend to start with the idea that we should give these letters the benefit of the doubt. And I can understand that because that's what tradition has told them and that's what the church has told them. But once you understand just the cottage industry of forgeries that were going around, and also the political and social capital that you could get by writing in someone else's name, this person wanted to have their ideas be on the level of Paul's ideas, and so you write a letter as Paul, and you can imitate Paul's language, and you're able to tweak Paul's ideas to your theological persuasion. And so I just think that once you understand that that's not an uncommon thing that happens in the ancient world, that's a common thing that's happening in early Christianity all over the place in letters that we don't have in our Bible. So you really have to use that as a standard to gauge these letters. And a lot of this really does sound apologetic. Oh, it is very different. It does sound like a different author, but this is the reason it's not. And that's not, anything is possible. I mean, Paul could totally have changed his writing style. It's possible, I guess. But we should be looking at this from a critical perspective.
Yeah, and like you said, if we were talking about 3 Corinthians, they would have no problem saying, yes, this writing style means it was not written by Paul. But they give special pleading to any canonical text. And I think that's fundamentally an incorrect way to do history. The whole point is to say church tradition has said this for years and years, but let's look at it with fresh eyes and do our own investigation. And the other thing to understand is why the church accepted certain books as being authoritative or being authentic from they were not doing the type of scholarship that is being done now. They weren't mathematically looking at the number of characters in each sentence. They weren't doing the types of research that's done now. The biggest reason that a book was determined to be authentic or not was, does the theology say what we want it to say? That's why the determination was made for many of these books. The pastoral epistles, again, comes to mind with this. It's oh, well, this says what we want it to say. So it wasn't as much, did Paul write it or did Paul not write it? It was is this getting us to the end point that we want to get to? And I think that highlights the difference between an apologist and a historian. A historian will take 3 Corinthians and Ephesians and Romans and put them all on the same plane, and let's analyze the language in these, the same for each. But the apologist says, no, these are in a special category because they've been canonized by the church, which is something that the Bible itself doesn't even ask you to do. So I just find it kind of frustrating when you're listening to the arguments of apologists. And that's not to say that there isn't some genuine debate about Ephesians and Colossians as to the authorship. Like, I think I pretty squarely come down on the side that it is a pseudepigrapha, that it was not penned by the Apostle Paul. But there are some scholars who I respect who say that, no, they think it probably is genuine. And, we can get into that. But as we go on in this series, we're going to get to some other books in the Bible that I think you really strain all credulity when you start claiming that it is genuine. There are some books that are very clearly forgeries that scholars have known for many, many years, and only the most extreme evangelical apologist will claim otherwise.
Yeah, these are more of the sort of controversial or disputed books. Colossians and Ephesians definitely have their apologists who think that they're Pauline, and I think that you can be earnest on either side of the debate too. Like John, I think that I actually was not immediately convinced that Ephesians and Colossians were not by Paul, but became convinced over like the course of hearing the different arguments. I think that there are people who think that they're genuine. I think the important thing is to have some sort of, a standard that you can judge and make some sort of a judgment about these books. And I think that I just want to like problematize the idea of like tradition being a standard or the canon being a standard, because those things are much more complicated than most people at a ground level think. And I also just think that it's important to recognize the that if we do have books in the Bible that are not written by Paul, we should at least be honest about that and not just attribute to Paul things that are written in his name.
Yeah, and there'll be a much bigger discussion about just the notion of canon in general. The reason a lot of Christians will defend the authenticity is simply because it is in the Bible. But that kind of, to me, ignores the problem that there were other books in the Bible also that have been removed. Books that, in the early centuries of the church were used as scripture by the church that later generations came along and said, no, we don't think this is authentic. And Christians have no problem saying, yeah, the Shepherd of Hermes is not an authentic, inspired book. However, anything that's in the canon that they grew up with absolutely is. And to me, that's just like a fundamental like contradiction of philosophy and how you're viewing the Bible. And I think just pointing this out, to me, Ben, I don't know about you, but the idea that there are forgeries in the Bible, growing up in the church, when I first learned about this as a young adult, man, it was shocking. I had never heard anything like this. I had never heard anyone say that before. I had never even thought about that concept, because to me, of course, the Paul wrote this. That's what I've been taught my entire life, and it really is kind of a shocking notion to think that, hey, maybe the person that's claiming to be writing this is not who they claim to be.
Yeah, I think that I totally agree. Even in college, we used to joke about Hebrews being written by Paul. And now it's such a ridiculous thing to even think about, because the language is so different, and it's so clearly not Paul, and almost every scholar agrees that it's not Paul. But authorship by the apostles was really taken seriously and was a concept that was super important. And I do think that it's shocking to think that it's a deceptive practice to do a forgery. It was in the ancient world. It is in the modern world. And to be writing in the name of apostles. One of the things I think that John and I have been emphasizing is sort of this struggle for authority that existed in the early church. And you still see a struggle for authority. And these texts are used as tools to have authority. So there's a reason that people want to keep them around today, and there's a reason people were affirming them back then, and there was a reason that people wrote them in other people's names. It was because it gave you social capital and authority to say you were the Apostle Paul, or to wield a book that agrees with your theology that was written by the Apostle Paul, or to say that you were in the line of the Apostle Peter. Those things were all ways to put a stamp on your own theological views. And so it's an important thing to remember, but the idea that we have forgeries in the Bible for an evangelical, I think, is just a shocking concept, but one that they should really examine. Again, I think that it's like totally fine to not think that these books are forged, but I think that it really, you should examine it really critically and closely, because I think there are major differences. You have to figure out, well, which Paul is right? Is it the Paul that says we're already raised, or is it the Paul that says we'll be raised with Christ at the end? That's just a question. Like, I don't know if that matters for your salvation, but it seems important to me. I mean, it was a whole emphasis of part of Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Like, these things are important.
Yeah, and something you hinted at in there that I want to say here at the end. A lot of Christians some Christians might concede that, okay, maybe Paul didn't actually write this. However, it was a common practice, and it was completely acceptable for someone to be writing, like maybe a follower of Paul, to later write down some of what they think is Pauline philosophy and to put it in his name. And that would have been an accepted policy. That would have been an accepted practice back then. But as it turns out, that's not true. It was not an accepted practice. It was viewed as deception, and it was condemned even back in the first century. So that does not seem to hold up.
Yeah, Christian apologists, I think, like to muddy that water and sort of say, oh, it's fine if he was writing in the name of Paul. That was like what people did back then. It was a way to show Paul honor, and not
like, okay,
really.
Well, then I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And then you should put it in the Bible.
Yeah, or let's just put 3 Corinthians in, or
right.
The letters to Paul and Seneca. Like, at a certain point, you have to be able to say, we have forgeries in this person's name, and so therefore, I mean, I think that's, like, I wanted to bring this up before. Like, Christians have a tendency, Christian apologists, of saying, like, we should start with the assumption that these books are genuine and are genuinely by the person that wrote them. And I actually think that that's not a good assumption to start with. Once you understand that there were forgeries all over the place in these people's names.
Amen.
So once you start to think that there are forgeries by Paul out there that were floating around in the early church and in early Christianity, then you have to start saying, okay, even the ones that we have that say they're written by Paul, we shouldn't just assume.
So, yeah, I was conversing with a friend of mine, a Christian friend, who we were talking about this, and I said exactly what you just said. I said, well, there were other letters from Paul, from Peter, that purport to be from Paul and Peter that are not in the Bible. And I had to debate with this person who was denying that that's true and saying, that's not true. We don't have anything in the name of Paul, anything in the name of Peter. And I was like, this is just a factual question here. Just like Google it. It's pretty I'm not making that up. Like we have a lot of that. And just knowing that fact alone, you're right. Like, okay, then what are the implications of that? Then how do we know what's in our Bible is not basically one of those documents? And I think it's really interesting. I believe it's the Apocalypse of Peter, which is a non-canonical book forged in the name of Peter. But some scholars think, based on the writing style alone, that whoever wrote the Apocalypse of Peter probably wrote 2 Peter. And
it almost made it into our Bible, I think.
Right. Well, it did. Apocalypse of Peter almost made it into the Bible, and that's a really interesting conversation as to why it's not now in the Bible. But I think that's really interesting. It's very possible that whoever was forging in the name of Peter for the Apocalypse of Peter very well may have written 2 Peter, which is in the Bible. So, but that we'll get to that when we go down that road. We've gone quite a long time on these. I was hoping, Ben, we could get into a quick Bible versus Bible. What do you think?
Let's do it.
And now it's time for Bible versus Bible.
This is Bible versus Bible, the segment where we take 2 Bible verses that seem on the surface contradictory, and we analyze it and break it down and try to determine if it is an actual contradiction. So today we're going to talk about something that is an issue in the church even to this day. We've talked about it a lot on previous episodes. We did, I think, a couple of episodes on the role of women in the church. And we're going to highlight that here to determine if this is a contradiction. And I think it'll be relevant to the discussion of forgeries in the New Testament also, because we're dealing with something that comes from a genuine letter of Paul and something that comes from what most scholars believe is not a genuine letter, is a forgery. So, can women be church leaders? Well, according to the book of Acts, they can, because you have Priscilla. She was a servant of the church. She expounded unto him the way of God, it says in Acts 18:26. You have Phoebe in Romans, the letter of Paul, mentioned as a deaconess. And you have Junia, who is an apostle. And that's also from Romans 16:7, of note among the apostles. But according to Paul in 1 Timothy, they cannot be leaders in the church, because Paul says, "Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." 1 Timothy 2:11 through 12. So, we've talked on that previous episode about how some people were so upset about this woman apostle in Romans that they changed the name from Junia to Junius. They actually changed the translation to make it a male name, to say, no, this was just a man. But that's clearly not what this is. It's talking about a woman. So is this a contradiction? I think it's a contradiction of teaching. I think the same Paul either drastically changed his mind later in life and totally went from someone that was very accepting of women in the churches, and then later in life changed his mind and completely turned against it, or it's what most scholars say, that someone writing in the name of Paul wrote 1 Timothy because he wanted to tamp down women's role in the church.
Yeah, I also think it's a contradiction. I think that it's very important to recognize Paul's reasoning for in Corinthians when he's talking, he talks about it in Galatians, he talks about it in Corinthians, the equality that comes in the body of Christ. The pneuma, the spirit, is given to everyone, to each individual person. In the body of Christ, there's total equality amongst believers, to where there's no discernible difference between Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female. And so if that's the foundation of Paul's equality in Christ, is because each believer gets the Spirit of God, then it seems that it doesn't seem consistent with what Paul would be teaching to say that women can't be in positions of authority. And again, it goes against what we have spoken clearly in a genuine Pauline letter in Romans 16. He talks about, he names few women leaders, Phoebe and Junia, but even more in addition to that. We just know that in the early Christian movement, it was oftentimes they were meeting in the houses of women that had money. It may have been women that were part of the initial Jesus movement in Galilee, at least according to the traditions that come in our Gospels. So it seems, and even the traditional teachings that John and I have talked about, the teaching from Matthew 19 about eunuchs, or you must hate your family, the members of your family are going to be your enemies. All of these things sort of speak to a disillusion of the family structure that was happening, and sort of the way that maybe the Jesus movement was looked down upon by having women in positions of authority and a bunch of unmarried men that were sort of like roaming the countryside. And so at a certain point, that tension maybe started to split, and more of a patriarchal, authoritarian wing decided to clamp down on these women that were in positions of authority. And I think we see that starting to happen in the household codes in Ephesians, and I think we definitely see it in the pastorals. So yeah, I think it's a contradiction that runs through the New Testament, and a big point of controversy in the early Jesus movement.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight, this is why it's important to recognize pseudepigrapha for what it is. Because think about, when people, oftentimes you'll hear evangelicals say, well, any of the books that are contested, what would you really lose? They're not really the important things. Like, what would you really lose if the pastorals were removed? Well, the way women have been treated in the church because of these books can't be understated. It's been hugely influential on the entire church, going all the way back, these books that Paul didn't even write. And so it would make a drastic difference, or at least, I'm not saying that Christians should throw them out of the Bible. I think that you should have a more academic understanding of the authorship, as opposed to just saying, like, the Apostle Paul, writing under the perfect inspiration of God, wrote this down, and this is the same as the words of Jesus themselves. No, this is somebody trying to assert themselves that thought that women were becoming too involved with the church and was trying to tamp that down. I think that's pretty clear. I do want to say that it's not as clear cut necessarily as we laid it out, because you also have, in a genuine letter of Paul, you have Paul saying, I do not permit a woman to speak. And that is in 1 Corinthians. Now, many scholars think that that's an addition, that verse was an interpolation added in for this exact reason, added in later. And there is some manuscript evidence, I believe, to support that. I know Bart Ehrman holds that view. And that makes a lot of sense, because just before that verse in 1 Corinthians, you have Paul talking about women having an active role in speaking in the church. And then all of a sudden you have this verse, but they're not allowed to speak. So it really does seem like a scribe came and wrote in the margin somewhere, I do not permit a woman to speak, and that got passed down. We don't have an answer to that, but I did want to add that in there to say it's not as clear as we may have laid it out originally.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what we're trying to say, too, is that in a lot of these things, just an awareness that it's not as clear-cut is better than pretending that it's really clear-cut. Because there is ambiguity. Like, there is definitely ambiguity, and even really good scholars will disagree on some of this stuff. So it's not as simple as just saying, this is what it says, or that this is just a forgery. I think it's like a conversation. But the residual effect of people taking a hard line of keeping women from positions of ministry or positions of authority in the church has been a big problem. I mean, the Southern Baptist Conference just had a huge meeting this summer where this whole thing was a controversy with some churches ordaining women, and they almost split, and there was a giant vote, and really a bunch of Christian nationalists were mobilizing around the goal of keeping women from ministry and sort of dragging up the old pro-slavery history of the Southern Baptist Convention. So it's like, this stuff doesn't just exist in a vacuum either. It's also like a big problem in the real world. Now, if those same Christian nationalists would realize that, like, they should be not completely certain what the text says either, I think that's a better position to hold. Like, we should all just be a little bit understanding that there's some interpretive push and pull, and that, again, the text is not inerrant, and our interpretation is always kind of a flexible thing as you're trying to figure out what the text says, what it meant, and what's genuine and what's not genuine.
So yeah, I mean, whether it's a forgery or not, and both me and you think it is a contradiction, and when people say, well, when there's differences, what importance does it really make? I can't stress enough. This is a huge problem. These verses here in the pastoral epistles have made 50% of the population unable to serve as church leaders. And definitely in the Catholic Church and in many evangelical and conservative churches also. Thankfully, that's starting to change a little bit. But I think that it has, these things have really big implications. And I think it's important to recognize these differences as opposed to just ignoring them or pushing them under the rug or saying, no, that's not really a problem at all.
Yeah, absolutely agree. It's important to... I think that's the first step, is to recognize that there's a problem before you can even do anything else, to say, like, wait a second, these are not saying the same thing. And that creates an issue. And then where you go from there is important too, but absolutely.
All right, Ben, why don't we end it there? I know we're eager to get into some of these other books and talk about why scholars think they may not be genuine to the claimed author. But why don't we end this show with a quote? Do you have one?
Sure. All right. This is from Thomas Paine. One good schoolmaster is of more use than 100 priests.
I like that one.
Me too.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Have a good night, all.
The Skeptics Bible Project is a John and Ben production, with intro music by John Lobker. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project, and follow us on all social media platforms at Skeptics Project. Got questions or comments? Email us at skepticsbibleproject@gmail.com.